Julianne, you're on mute.
That's not going to work very well, is it? If I if I don't speak to people in person, but I think there's a few participants still joining us. But as they are, I wanted to extend a welcome to everyone, and thank you for joining us for this side event, spotlighting the role of gender data for gender equality and showcasing some exciting new approaches to accelerate the action. My name is Julianne Guevara, and I have the privilege of being Australia's Ambassador for Gender Equality. I know we have people joining us, well, I understand we have people joining us from around the world. One plus, of course, of being on a digital platform, although I think we've had a few little hiccups along the way this evening. But I'm really pleased to see so many participants joining us at this stage. I know that some of you have actually submitted questions when you were registering for the event, so thank you very much for these. We will try, obviously, to address some of those at the end of the presentation, but I mean, continue to put those questions in the chat box. If we don't answer them, if we don't have sufficient time during the course of the actual meeting or the event, what we will do is try and answer the questions post-event. Of course, Australia's investment in closing the gender data gaps confirms the importance we give to this issue, and I'm delighted to be part of today's event showcasing why gender data matters. Just to perhaps give you some context for this, I mean, obviously 25 years ago, the landmark Beijing Platform of Action emphasised the importance of investing in sex disaggregated data and to provide this data about the circumstances of women. 25 years on, unfortunately, we still have a significant gender data gap. The realities we see around us are not fully reflected in global comparable national data. And this is hindering progress towards gender justice and inclusive, equitable and sustainable development. Obviously, COVID-19 has underlined the importance of gender data for understanding the gendered impacts of the virus and responses to it, and ensuring that we have effective planning responses. Of course, reliable, relevant and recent data are essential for evidence-based actions that deliver transformative changes. Both qualitative and quantitative data is absolutely necessary. The three organisations that are working to close the data gender gap are, of course, the International Women's Development Agency, the World Food Programme, and the United Nations Human Rights Commission for Refugees. IWDA, WPF, and UNHCR will each share some of their innovation and their approach to their work at this point in time. So we have Ruth Mayatala from Dignity Pacific, who oversees data collection for IMD study in the Solomon Islands. I can see Ruth on the screen. It will underline, of course, some of the value of some of the gender data for policymakers and advocates alike. So without further ado, what I might do is introduce each panel as part of this group now. So we have with us Dr. Kylie Fisk, who is a postdoctoral research fellow at the International Women's Development Agency, where she has been the technical lead for the Individual Deprivation Measure Program since 2016. She undertook her first full analysis of IDM data collected by the Fijian Bureau of Statistics, working in partnership with IWDA in 2015-16, and led the planning, implementation and analysis of findings for the 2020 IDM study in the Solomon Islands, where she will speak today. As I mentioned, we have Ruth Mayatala, who is a researcher and also the director of Dignity Pacific, a research firm in the Solomon Islands. She has led held the partnership position in the Solomon Islands government, and worked with several international NGOs, and was a coordinator of the International Finance Corporation's Wakamare, an award-winning program improving business outcomes in the Solomon Islands through advancing workplace gender equality. Dignity Pacific led the data collection for the IDM study in the Solomon Islands. We also have with us Jacqueline Paul, who is the Senior Gender Advisor for the World Food Programme and one of the world's leading humanitarian organisations, of course, delivering on food assistance in emergencies and working with communities to improve nutrition and build resilience. Jacqueline leads the integration of gender in WPF's work across the humanitarian action and its development programming. Prior to joining WPF, she worked for the UN Regional Commission for Asia and the Pacific, ESCAP. She's also worked for Oxfam Australia and UNDP in Somalia, UNICEF in Palestine, UNRWA in the Gaza Strip, and the International Organization for Migration in Haiti, and also the ILO in Afghanistan. Last but not least, we have Bernadette Castle-Hollingsworth, who is the Deputy Director and of the Division of International Protection and the head of the Field Protection Service at the United Nations High Commissioner for Refugees. She joined UNHCR in 2000 and held numerous positions in protection and management in Pakistan, Liberia, Uganda, Sri Lanka, Tanzania, and many other countries. From November 2017 to 2018, she was the Senior Protection Coordinator in Cox's Bazar in Bangladesh and in UNHCR headquarters in Geneva, joined it in May 2019. So without further ado, we might address our first question to the panelists, and the first question will be for Kylie. Turning to you first, why does individual level measurement matter for gender sensitive measurement of poverty?
Thank you so much, Ambassador, and thanks to my colleagues at UNHCR, WFP, and Dignity Pacific. If UNHCR could put the slides up, please. We can adjust through our slides. Are they visible to participants? Thank you so much. And can I please get control? Thank you. So thanks everyone for joining us. I'll be talking about addressing this question by talking about gender insights from individual level data through the contributions of the individual deprivation measure. So the IDM is a gender sensitive measure of deprivation that challenges two key assumptions about the nature of poverty. The first is that all members of a household can be reasonably assumed to share the same economic circumstances. And the second is that money is a reliable and meaningful lens through which to measure poverty. And we address these gaps in a couple of ways through our methodology. So for a start, we conduct surveys with all adults in selecting dwellings, and we administer survey modules across 15 dimensions of deprivation, including economic, social, political, and environmental dimensions. The panel there shows the different dimensions that we assess, so food, water, shelter, health, education, energy, fuel, sanitation, relationships, clothing, violence, family planning, environment, voice, time use, and work, as well as a module on individual level asset ownership and control over those assets. So across the 4 years of the IDM program, we've found that these two key findings. So one is that individuals in the same household differ significantly across these different economic, social, political, environmental dimensions. And the second is that measuring individuals within households uncovers previously invisible gender inequalities. That is, household level measurement hides gender inequality. 2 independent evaluations of the IDM program found that collecting data from multiple household members doesn't actually produce redundant information because household members are sufficiently different from each other, and also that it's cost effective to collect data from multiple individuals in the same household compared to simple random sampling of individuals. So taken together, what this means is that when enumerators are already at households, we're getting so much more information from measuring multiple members of that household, and it's actually cost effective to stay there and collect the individual data. So this is a big motivation to stop household level measurement. I'm going to talk about some specific findings from individual level measurement from our study in the Solomon Islands that was conducted this year between March and April in 2 provinces, Central and Guadalcanal. It was a collaboration between IWCA and the World Food Programme in partnership with the Australian University and supported by DFAT. And there were 1,862 respondents from 849 households. And we conducted this study to gain insights into these different 15 dimensions of the lives of men and women in Central and Guadalcanal provinces. So I'll present a selection of findings next across some of these selected dimensions. The first is shelter. We found that even though men and women inside households share the same 4 walls and roof, inside the household, the circumstances are different. So more women than men have experienced anxiety over the possibility of eviction. More men than women say that their dwelling ownership is recognised by the government. And then even in materials inside the household, we find that more men than women say that they have adequate bedding, such as blankets, mats, and mattresses to sleep comfortably compared to women. In terms of education, we see significant, not just gender, but also age differences, both in educational attainment and in functional skills across literacy and numeracy. Education deprivation increases with age, but what also increases with age is the gender gap. So this illustrates the importance of individual level data to enable these intersectional analyses, particularly at the intersection of gender and age. Clothing is one of our dimensions that we know public presentation is linked to stigma around poverty, social stigma. We find that more women than men lack sufficient and acceptable formal clothing, and also more women than men lack protective clothing from seasons and hazards. And then related to this is sufficiency of sanitary products, and we find that only 36% of women in our provinces always have enough access to sanitary products. So this is a huge gender gap that isn't usually covered in multi-topic surveys, but that is inherently related to poverty and people's social experiences of poverty, particularly women. Voice is one of the biggest gender gaps that we see across our dimensions. More men than women inside the same household have sole decision-making power over their household finances, their large purchases, the duration of their work, study, and social commitments, and particularly in terms of lack of control over financial decisions. This is linked to barriers to women's economic empowerment. Time use is also another barrier to economic empowerment and a huge barrier in terms of poverty alleviation. We find that in the 2 provinces in the Solomon Islands, the primary activities undertaken by men other than sleeping were paid work, followed by socializing and self-care. Whereas for women, the primary activities undertaken in waking hours are unpaid domestic work, followed by unpaid care work. And when we look at the cross-section of time use and work, we find that for women who don't do paid work, there's an increase in the amount of unpaid domestic and care labour that they're doing, but this finding doesn't replicate for men. So men who don't do paid work actually aren't participating more in unpaid domestic care and labour. And what we see there is the double burden for women, where even women who are doing paid work are still doing nearly twice as much unpaid work as men who are doing either paid or unpaid work. We use the data from the Solomon Islands to prepare some information about COVID-19 response and its gendered components. So we found that across a range of domains, women were less prepared to prevent and respond to COVID-19 due to gender gaps in ability to access public information. So this includes rates of literacy, participation in local meetings, access to information and communication technology like radios, television, and mobile phones, which women are far less likely to own or have access to or have control over. We find gender gaps in access to basic sanitation, including hand washing facilities at home, gender gaps in access to protective workplace environments such as paid sick leave, and gender gaps in health problems arising from inhalation of unclean cooking fuel linked to domestic roles and responsibilities inside the household. So here we see the intersection of various dimensions producing multiple deprivations for women that impact their ability to respond to a pandemic or a humanitarian crisis. And this information wouldn't be available without individual intra-household data. What we found in our studies and from the program overall are these really strong conclusions that poverty is not just monetary. Poverty isn't experienced by all members of the household equally. Poverty is linked to gender equality inside households, and that individual level data is a powerful tool to address gender inequality through visibility, validation, and accountability. We know that in a humanitarian crisis, we can prevent what we can predict, and individual level data enhances our ability to predict the gendered impacts of a crisis, and that makes it a crucial investment. These are the acknowledgements of the program in terms of the support from the Department of Foreign Affairs and Trade, the partnership with the Australian National University and IWDA, project support from WFP, and some information about the work being carried forward in the future through the IDM. Thank you for the opportunity to talk about the importance of individual level data for gender equality.
Thank you very much, Kylie. And I mean, I think we can see from that just the richness of the data that you have been able to collect through these studies. I'm sure people will have lots of questions, but we'll leave that till the end. I might now turn to Ruth and ask a question of you, if I might, Ruth. Ruth, what role does gender data play in your advocacy on gender equality and women's rights in the Solomon Islands? And how do data gender gaps hinder that sort of progress? Over to you.
You're on mute, Ruth.
Thank you so much, Ambassador. Can you hear me?
Yes, we can hear you well.
All right. Thank you so much, Ambassador. I would like to firstly recognize my colleagues and international partners, especially International Development Agency and the World Food Program. UNHCR, please, can you put up my slides? Thank you. Can I have my slides up, please?
Ruth, you might have control of the slides if you press.
Oh, all right. So I will just briefly talk about gender data for gender advocacy and share a little bit about our experience from the Solomon Islands. Firstly, just a little bit of in 1995, a number of women represented the Solomon Islands at the Beijing 4th World Conference on Women and began advocacy work, especially on policy development. And the Solomon Islands government made an effort then to develop a national women's policy that was informed by the National Statistics Division of the Solomon Islands government. At the time, sex disaggregated data was very rare. So the national women's policy was reviewed and revised later, and some updated data on violence against women was included in 2009. The national policy was then updated to what is now the Gender Equality and Women's Development Policy, which is the government's roadmap and outcomes for women's development in the Solomon Islands. However, sorry, I'll go back. And then later on, the policy on violence against women was developed and informed and established the Family Protection Act in 2016 and was effective from April the 1st. Due to the lack of information and on gender data, the focus on gender indicators has been limited since independence and since the signing of important conventions such as the Convention on the Elimination of All Forms of Discrimination Against Women in 2001. There are some challenges of working in a data poor context. In the absence of data, people can fill knowledge gaps with unfounded assumptions and stereotypes. They may rely on gender. They may reach out for out-of-date information, and they may also ignore differences between urban and rural or younger or older women. So advocacy work without the correct information is not effective and sustainable. So gender data gaps hinder progress because women's rights organizations do not have the evidence to support their advocacy work. That's the main experience that we have here since 1995. So outside of the national statistics system, quality data collection should also be operated and owned locally. Civil organizations are uniquely connected to marginalized communities in a way that complements official statistics. Gender bias can show up through data collection itself, so women-led research firms, a primary mechanism for closing gender data gaps. As in the case of Dignity Pacific, we're employing single mothers, young women and men with disability, which also provides opportunities for empowerment through data collection itself and can shift perceptions in the community. As a researcher, I see myself as a key player in advocacy work and closing the gender equality gap, ensuring that sex-segregated data is available for gender analysis and informing policy reform decisions. The value of the IDM study in Solomon Islands. Prior to the IDM study in Solomon Islands, little existing information about gender dynamics inside households. The IDM study has provided individual level data is rich and provides connections between different dimensions for a full understanding of women's lives. As Solomon Islands National Council of Women gave feedback on the IDM study, says IDM is giving a voice to the unheard. So quantitative data can uncover ceilings in women's achievements produced by harmful gender norms. Example, participation in political processes. So the IDM study in Solomon Islands was the first ever project in Solomon Islands with Women's Machinery and National Statistics Office collaborating on project design and priorities. The IDM study will inform and the National Public Health Strategy, which is due for review in 2020. In relation to the IDM work, International Women's Development Agency and the Women's Rights Action Movement has commissioned a study of perceptions, the public perceptions of women as political leaders. And the research has been commissioned in 2008 and has been launched recently in Solomon Islands. So while many Solomon Islanders see politics as a level playing field, it is obvious that many factors are holding women back. While gradual change may help to remove these barriers, in the short term, TSM may be necessary to normalize women's political leadership in Solomon Islands. So the recently released IWDA Public Perceptions of Women in Leadership reports on temporary special measures is now informing the CSM process and also supporting RAM in their advocacy work. It is strengthening the case for the current 5 provinces, including Western, Guadalcanal, Malaita, Isabel, and Timothy provinces that are piloting TSM policy and legislative reform at the provincial government level. Gender data is needed for gender equality and advocacy in Solomon Islands. Meeting the global progress indicators for countries like Solomon Islands that are rated amongst the poor can be a challenge for government, NGOs, and the private sector alike. To achieve these development indicators, research is key to provide the necessary data to address poverty and raise awareness of the challenges faced by women. So informing development processes and strategies is like hitting a bullseye. Data plays a key role in providing support to the decision makers, policy makers, legislators, government machinery, women rights organizations, and strategic key stakeholders. This means that advocates can push and relevant ministers can action priorities in a resource-scarce environment. Data can help answer the question, why this action and why now? Thank you very much.
Ruth, thank you so much for that presentation, and I think you really have brought home the connection between advocates such as yourself and the importance of that in terms of influencing policy makers at all levels. I think that was a really useful message for us all. And of course, the basis of that, of course, is good evidence base and the data. So thank you. I'd now like to turn to Jacqueline, if I can. Jacqueline, of course, works with the World Food Programme, and the World Food Programme has developed the Gender Equality for Food Security measure. Can I ask you, Jacqueline, to please share with us why you've developed this measure and what is the data revealing?
I would be happy to, Julianne. UNHCR, do I have command of the slide?
Yes, please go ahead.
Okay, all right. And just a slightly technical question, how do I move from one slide to the next?
Just hover your mouse over the presentation and you will see on the left side a small menu for moving the slides.
Apparently there is, but I'm struggling to work out how to find that, everyone who is online and wanting me to show the presentation. Okay.
Okay, just in case, just let me know when you move to next slide and I will move.
Okay, super. Can you move to the next slide, please? So there should be a title slide on the Gender Equality for Food Security measure. Next slide. Ah, super. Okay, that's great. I will just say next slide, and thank you very much to UNHCR for helping me with this. So, WFP, the World Food Programme, our mandate is to end hunger and SDG 2, and our motto is saving lives and changing lives. So going to Julianne's question, if we are to save lives and change lives, we need data so that we can understand and see in all their diversity and all their intersectionality, the lives to be saved and changed. And we identified the person, the individual, as being an important focus because gender and food and the associated inequalities and insecurities are two elements of the daily lives of all of us, and these are aspects of our lives that are not captured in household measures and population indices. Next slide, or possibly the one after that, please. Okay, so in support of closing this gender data gap, WFP, we teamed up with Gallup to develop the Gender Equality for Food Security, or GE4FS measure. And in this initiative, we've also benefited from the expertise of colleagues from the Statistical Division of the Food and Agricultural Organisation, FAO. And what you see on the screen are some of the considerations that underpinned how we went about and what we wanted to do in creating the Gender Equality for Food Security measure. But I'll skip straight over that and tell you what the Gender Equality for Food Security measure actually is on the next slide, please. So the GE4FS is a partnering of the 8 questions of the Food Insecurity Experience Scale as developed by FAO, which are those on the screen. And on the next slide, there are the empowerment aspects of the GE4FS. So next slide, please. So because we are focusing on the individual, we needed to translate equality into something that is lived. And this translation is empowerment. We chose 5 dimensions of empowerment, being those on the screen: decision-making ability, financial self-sufficiency, freedom from violence, reproductive freedom, and unpaid labour. Clearly, as we all know, empowerment is made up of more than these 5 dimensions, but the 5 chosen dimensions do capture resources, agency, and physical integrity. And in case anyone is interested, we did outline the rationale for this choice in our report. And the 18 yes-no questions that make up the empowerment scale of the GE4FS are also listed in the report. On the next slide, okay, thank you. In 2018 and 2019, we administered the GE4FS in the 17 countries that are shown in the map. We asked the 2 sets of questions, the 8 FIES questions and the 18 empowerment items, of randomly sampled populations. And as the GE4FS was administered by Gallup, the standard Gallup World Poll methodology was followed. This is also outlined in the report. But briefly, what we did were telephone interviews and in-person interviews with persons aged 15 years and older. We interviewed approximately 1,000 individuals in each country with an equal split between women and men. And on the next slide, once we had all the data, we cleaned it, weighted it, and vetted it for accuracy and consistency, and then we did those statistical analyses that you can see up there. We ran the analyses on the pooled data and on the country level data, and if you're interested in the stats, I will refer you to the report as well and move on to the interesting aspect, which is what the data shared with, suggested to us. So on the next slide, please. So looking at food insecurity, in 10 of the 17 countries, women are more likely than men to be hungry. And in 7 countries, we found very small differences between the proportions of women and men who experience moderate or severe food insecurity. But looking at empowerment, the data from the 17 countries show that men are more likely to experience being empowered than are women. In only 4 countries were little differences in empowerment evident between women and men. And 3 of those 4 countries, which were Lesotho, the United Kingdom, and Venezuela, are also countries where differences in food insecurity between women and men were found to be marginal. At the country level, the analysis showed us that men are more likely to be empowered than women, so reflecting the same as for the global data. That gender is often a more significant factor than age, education, and where people live in determining empowerment. But to make it complicated, experiences of empowerment are influenced by age, education level, and location. So this makes it challenging for policymakers and practitioners, with age and education and location do not operate in the same way across countries. So for example, age was a more significant factor for men in Kyrgyzstan, but for women in Egypt and Nicaragua. And where education influences how you experience being empowered or the extent to which you experience empowerment, there's a tendency for empowerment to increase with years of formal education. And we saw this in Kenya, in Tajikistan, in Nigeria. In several countries, the levels of experienced empowerment increase as a person moves from a rural or village environment to an urban or city location. This trajectory, though, is not universal. So, for example, we had rural women in Kenya reporting being more empowered than women in the urban locations. What stood out clearly, though, from across all the 17 countries, and reflecting what Kylie just shared with us about the data from the Solomon Islands, was that it is women, not men, who spend the most time doing housework. The data were very clear that a reduction in the time spent on unpaid care and domestic work, the cooking, the cleaning, and the caring for household members has a significantly greater impact on women reporting being empowered than it does for men. So on to my last slide, where I'll try and draw some conclusions for you. We have 4 conclusions that we're pulling together from the current pool of GE4FS data, and they are that empowerment reduces the probability of a person being food insecure. that the effect of empowerment levels on food insecurity is similar for women and men, but that empowerment levels are, on average, higher for men than for women, and consequently, women are generally likely to be more food insecure than men. So the implications of these conclusions are that hunger cannot be reduced or eliminated solely through the provision of adequate food. Rather, the multiple dimensions of empowerment, the factors experienced by individuals that establish equality of rights, need to be understood and addressed. And our GE4FS data are suggesting that decision-making ability, financial self-sufficiency, reproductive freedom, freedom from violence, and unpaid labour need to be tackled to reduce inequalities and food insecurity. And of those dimensions, it's worth stressing that the data highlight that recognising, reducing and redistributing unpaid care and domestic work are priorities, and particularly for the empowerment of women. So for drafting and implementing relevant policies and programs, including those intended to end hunger and achieve food security, what is evident from our GE4FS data is the need to see and understand gender inequality, while importantly, at the same time, recognising and responding to the diversity that makes up these categories, women, men. So it is really critical, as we're all sharing on the panel today, that the person in all of her, his, their diversity be seen, understood and empowered. And this requires individual level data collection and engagement. And I think this is a particularly critical point at this time, given the urgent need for relevant responses to the COVID-19 pandemic. Thanks, Julianne. Back to you.
Thanks, Jackie, for that. That was really very useful. And if anyone is following the chat, your report, of course, is up there with a hyperlink for people to access it at any time. And as I said, I think there will be some questions for you, Jacqueline, after that really fascinating presentation. I think the connection you've drawn between obviously the empowerment issue and the probability of food insecurity, you know, is a real breakthrough, and you can only do that with this kind of richness of data. So if I could now turn finally to Bernadette. Bernadette, what in your view is the value of qualitative data in our work? How has UNHCR been using this to support and advance gender equality through its work?
Thank you very much, Ambassador. I hope you can hear me clearly. Good evening to you, and good morning and good afternoon to colleagues joining from elsewhere in the world. I'm very happy to be here on the panel alongside Kylie, Ruth, and Jacqueline, and hopefully will complement nicely what they have been telling us about quantitative data. Let me start by saying that both qualitative and quantitative data and data collection is a fundamental component of UNHCR's work to provide international protection, assistance, and solutions to refugees, IDPs, and other forcibly displaced persons around the world. We use data and statistics to inform and optimize our work on a daily basis, and that's in 135 countries. And we release every year, in particular, the Global Trends Report on forced displacement worldwide. We, as a matter of fact, just released the most recent report a month ago, 3 weeks ago, I should say. And you see here on display the report that actually showed the record number of forcibly displaced persons in 2019, in particular refugees and IDPs. I also wanted to remind us that the Global Compact on Refugees that was adopted by the General Assembly in 2018 stresses in particular the importance of collection, analysis, and sharing of age, gender, disability, and diversity disaggregated data on refugees and returnees in particular, as Jacqueline was just also mentioning in her conclusions. And this is obviously in line with the SDGs and the 2030 agenda. Since last year, UNHCR, for the same reason, has been working very closely with the World Bank, and we are engaged with them on improving global statistics on forced displacement through a joint data center that was inaugurated by the Secretary General last year. In addition to the quantitative data that we collect through registrations, I think we heard also from Kylie's household surveys and other mechanisms, we have to recognize the great importance of qualitative data to truly understand the people behind the numbers. Qualitative data explains rather than measures, and it helps us to interpret the quantitative data and vice versa. We know that forced displacement impacts people differently, and that understanding people's unique experience is key for planning and delivering an effective and responsive response to all, including women, girls, boys and men in all their diversities. And in particular, understanding complex issues related to gender, power, social norms, understanding gender-related barriers and inequalities that prevent women and girls from realizing their rights require qualitative approach to data collection and analysis. Now, in recent years, in UNHCR, we have increased our efforts to collect and analyze qualitative data. You see here on the slide some examples of reports that are publicly available. And we've done that in particular when it comes to gender equality. Now, this documentation work is key to support knowledge management, to inform our programming, but also to support innovation. And we've seen and we've learned, sometimes through the hard way with COVID, for example, that we need to adapt quickly, and that it's very useful to document practices that are actually advancing gender equality so that they can be replicated as soon as possible when they are indeed effective. To strengthen, however, this documentation work, we have also in the past faced a number of challenges. And this is the reason why we developed a standardized methodology to document our work. And so why a standardized methodology? Despite there being a long history of implementing practices across our operations, and that over the past 70 years, we noticed that we were not always consistent and that the quality approach to how we were documenting and disseminating some of our practices were not up to standard. We also realized that some colleagues in the field sometimes failed to share with us the good work they were doing because they were not sure that what they had to share was meeting thresholds that would be acceptable. And the necessity we saw to develop a methodology to set clear standards for all. The objectives really is to improve consistency and quality, and also to create a habit for our field colleagues to document what they are doing. We also wanted to establish a distinct criteria that would allow us to capture practices that are interesting, innovative, and unique, and criteria that we could apply across contexts, whether we were working with, for example, IDPs in urban contexts or in camp settings. We also, of course, wanted to make sure we would document both what works and what doesn't work, because we can learn from both. Now, in terms of concretely the methodology that we developed, and based on the existing methodologies that existed out there, we decided to apply a three-tier approach whereby we collect promising practices, emerging practices, and also case studies. This helps us establish clear thresholds and includes incremental steps between each category, if you will, of practices. Those that meet the higher standards and demonstrate evidence are the promising practices, and they are subject to more scrutiny, obviously. The emerging practices are those that show some signs of potential or have already produced some results. And on the other hand, we also decided to systematically document case studies that are more loosely defined and that allow us to capture failed attempts sometimes as lessons learned as well. This is really intentional. So that assists us, if you will, in encouraging documentation and sharing in general. In terms of the criteria, I won't be very long on that, and we would be happy to provide more information after the event of today. But just to say that each practice is reviewed based on a number of criteria, and based on how many of these criteria are present, will determine whether we are talking about a promising or an emerging practice or a case study. But what I wanted to underline in particular here in our new methodology, if you will, is the self-rating tool, to say that we've introduced this tool to allow our colleagues to actually ensure the full participation of all stakeholders where they work, and in particular, the forcibly displaced individuals and communities themselves, so that they can themselves also opine on whether the data collected and analyzed actually meets standards from their perspective, and also really the practice that our colleagues, if you will, intend to present as a good practice actually advances gender equality and the empowerment of girls and women, in particular from their own perspective. We thought it was important to underline this. And I will finish with a few conclusions myself by saying that colleagues often ask us when they are in the field, what works, what has worked elsewhere, what can we do here, what have we already learned, and why should we, what can we do not to start from scratch. We know, working in so many different contexts, that there are many practices and interventions out there that are happening and that are impactful and that actually advance gender equality. Our aim through the new methodology we have developed is to ensure that we encourage colleagues to share what they are doing and to collectively learn from that. We also, of course, want to learn from what works and what doesn't work, as I said, where it works and under which circumstances. So we are able to draw lessons that have the potential to be replicated in many contexts. And then I'll finish by saying that understanding and seeing the people behind the numbers is exactly what qualitative data enables us to do. It's essential when it comes to addressing complex gender-related barriers and inequalities that prevent women and girls from realizing their rights. And I would say probably because this is, of course, the field I know best, that it's particularly important in conflict and fragile context in which we work to make this a success. Thank you very much. Back to you.
Bernadette, thank you very much for that intervention. I mean, I think you've really drawn out for us the importance of establishing a standardized methodology in order to draw out those lessons. But I think, several times in your intervention, you stressed that importance of learning from the failed attempts, things that hadn't gone right as well. And I think that's a very important lesson, for us all in terms of, why we collect information and qualitative information is to really learn from what we've done right, but also what we've done incorrectly. We don't have very much time left, unfortunately, although I'm sure there are a lot of questions that have been generated out of the presentations this evening. What I will try and do is perhaps ask a few of the questions that we received from people when they registered for this event. And what we will do with the remainder of the questions, because I see they're still coming in, and we certainly would encourage you to continue with those questions. What we will look to do is put them on the Q&A blog of the Individual Deprivation Measure website. So those details as well, I presume we can put on the chat so that people will know where to go to look for the responses to the questions that they posed during the course of this event. What I might do then is, because I'm very conscious of the time and we've probably got about 5 minutes for questions, I might direct my first question to Jacqueline, if that's okay, because there are a couple of questions coming. I'll have to take my glasses off because I'm using my phone as well to look at these questions. But the questions that we've received is a question about, obviously, the Gender Equality for Food Security measure, which asks about the relationship between food security, women's empowerment. I think you covered that a little bit during your presentation, but also the visibility of women as farmers. I mean, obviously, there are questions, I think, about how can the data we collect and how we collect it help give visibility to the contributions of women farmers.
Thanks, Julianne. I think this question really speaks to the purpose and the points and the key message of this event, which is about what data are we collecting, who are we collecting it with, and how is the data being shared and used. So when I'm thinking about, agriculture, because like FAO, WFP works in that area as well, are we working with women farmers and women's producer organisations? Are we recording who owns what agricultural assets, and particularly around land? Are we measuring who does what, like using and investing in time use surveys? What about the advocacy with the decision makers and the people that control the money? And I think the question also speaks to the points around the centrality of partnerships and collective action. So this is like, as the question is, how do we make the invisible visible and then resource women's farmers and the organisations and entities that are there to work with them for the empowerment and the change that we're all seeking. And before I just hand back to you, I have seen the question around country level data. If you click on the link to the report, we have all the country level data, and if you email me, I can share you the country level reports. Thanks, Julianne.
Jacqueline, that was fantastic, and also great to direct people to the actual reports that are up on the chat. I might turn quickly to Kylie. We've received a couple of questions actually that relate to the need for gender data across a life course. From your experience, particularly with the individual deprivation measure, what are the benefits of having data that can provide insights into the intersection between gender and age? And that came up in a few of the presentations tonight, including within households. And how can we strengthen the availability of this data?
Thanks so much. I interpret that question as strengthening availability and also quality of that data. And so as someone who works in the technical space, there's a couple of comments I'd make. So one is that in my slides, I talked about education deprivation and how we really see their deprivation at the intersection of gender and age. But what we have to consider from a technical perspective is that we're seeing cohort effects there. So cross-sectional data will tell you about different age cohorts, but not the life cycle of women who are young now. To understand actually women who are young now and then moving through the ages and the different life stages, we really require regular individual level data collection, disaggregated by gender and age, or we need panel or longitudinal data to actually be tracking individuals. And this requires a lot of resource investment, but it's worthwhile, otherwise that information is just missing. Another practice we need to end, I would advise us ending sooner rather than later, is having upper age limits on eligibility for surveys. Often big surveys, particularly poverty surveys, have the upper age limit at around 65. And this is to do with concerns about consent and the ability to participate. But to me, that talks to not to having an age limit, but actually to improving our data practices. So if the concerns are about facilitating functional difficulties such as hearing and seeing for older adults, then we as data collectors need to be facilitating that rather than cutting off older people from participating in data collection. Another point I would make is that when we analyze data, we need to be careful about the ages that we're grouping together. There's a general trend, and we do it sometimes in our work as well, to take people 18 to 35, 35 to 65, and then 65 plus. Whereas the circumstances between an 85-year-old woman and a 65-year-old woman are really huge. This is a little technical tweak that we can make in our data collection, analysis, and dissemination to improve the availability of the data. And then another point that I would make is we need intra-household data to consider relational information. So an older woman who's a widow is going to be in a very different circumstance to an older married woman. And we know that poverty really increases with widows in the absence of socioeconomic support structures. So this is why we also need relational information in addition to age information. And in strengthening availability, we need people like those on this panel and those in the audience, advocates, lobbying government to create demand to which donors can respond for aging data. And the other thing we need to do is get the evidence that we have now out there. My experience is that when you show decision makers, this is what's happening with older women and younger women. There's this natural instinct to want to know more and uncover more. What about older rural women? What about older women with disabilities? So we need to put the best practice out there. And there's this natural inclination to want to see more. So I think this is how we create and sustain interest and availability of data about the lives of women throughout the life cycle, which is important and highlighted under the current COVID crisis. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Kylie. There's a couple of more questions that we might get through. I think also there is that information on where the rest of the Q&A questions will be addressed on the individual deprivation measures website. So that's up for you if you don't feel your questions were actually covered by the bringing together of the questions that we have done tonight. But I will address one quickly to Bernadette. We have a question about the challenges of data collection, and I think you've mentioned this as well, in fragile and conflict-affected contexts, and the importance of such data for addressing the needs and rights of individuals and groups in challenging contexts. So could you just draw up perhaps a little bit more about how UNHCR actually approaches these issues?
Thank you, Ambassador. So indeed, I mean, to be very honest, when I started working with UNHCR exactly 20 years ago, we were collecting data manually. Things have changed quite a lot over the past 20 years. And so, of course, we have adapted because we do work, I mean, in more than 70% of our operations in border, remote or conflict areas. We have adapted the tools and the methodologies we have applied, but we are able to indeed collect data in such context. However, maybe I would like to say two things. First of all, and Jacqueline mentioned the importance of partnerships. When we talk about data collection, the partnerships are important, even though UNHCR does a lot of data collection itself. We are always trying to work very closely with government authorities, including at the local level, but not only, also at the national level, as well as with colleagues from WFP, other UN agencies, and also civil society organizations, women's organizations. These partnerships are key to make sure also that sometimes to ensure that we can collect data or have access to data that we cannot collect ourselves, but also to be able to triangulate the data that we have. But more importantly, and I will finish with that, I wanted to also mention the partnership that we are having with refugee and IDP, sometimes returning communities themselves. We consider them today as agents of change and agents in data collection and in data analysis. They have capacities that we need to absolutely work with in order to make sure our work is informed, including in the most difficult circumstances, by what they see as important for them from a data quantitative or qualitative perspective. Thank you.
Thanks, Bernadette. One last question, and this one will be to Ruth, because I think we have pretty much run out of time, so we've gone a little bit over time. But Ruth, I just wanted to ask you one quick question that we received from someone while they were registering. Obviously, the importance, there's a question about the importance of health access for gender equality. What are your reflections on this issue, having recently overseen, of course, the collection of the data, as you mentioned, for the IDM study in the Solomon Islands?
Thank you, Ambassador. I think I must say that the IDM study that has been recently completed is a groundbreaking work here in the Solomon Islands, because in order for us to improve our targets on gender equality in the area of health, I feel that first, the education gap between men and women must be closed, and in order for us to achieve gender equality in the health sector. For example, because men have better literacy rates, they could have confidence to ask appropriate questions when they go into health facilities. And second, the IDM study has revealed through that 48.5% of women and 42.5% of men practice open toileting when at home. This is a high risk for us, given the situation of the COVID-19. So we need to focus our attention on the health sector. And third, it's about whose priority is it that the public health is focusing on. Is it prioritizing women as its a focus or not? And finally, to close the gender gaps in the health sector, we have to find solutions, especially to respond to COVID-19. That's all from me. And also to refer to the IDM report that is published online. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Ruth, and thank you for sort of ending on that note about, as I said at the outset of the actual event, the connection about ensuring that we have good quality data at this time to address ensure that our policy responses are effective to address COVID-19. So I think that was a really important note to end this conversation on. I mean, obviously making visible the circumstances of women and men in their diversity is obviously the foundation of a more focused and effective action on gender equality more broadly, and to realise human rights and, of course, the fundamental freedoms, and secure a sustainable future for people, around the planet. We really don't have time to waste. This was one of the actions, as we said at the outset, for the Beijing Action Plan. It is 25 years later. And so this is an important, the work that is being undertaken by all of our presenters is vitally important in terms of addressing some of those gender data gaps that we spoke about at the outset. So obviously convincing decision makers of the need to accelerate action on equality and for the transformation of actions and ensuring that they're properly resourced, we do need this data. So I really do want to thank wholeheartedly all of the panelists for this particular event. I would like to thank all of those people who have tuned in, the participants, to listen and participate in this particular event today. And as I said, if you are interested in having your questions answered, because there were a stream of them, please do go to the Individual Deprivation Measures website and the Q&A blog there, and I'm sure you will find some of the answers. There is really a lot of information in all of those reports, and I really look forward to going through them myself as well. So thank you, everyone, for joining us today. Thank you.